I've decided I want to go ahead and finish my series out here real quick. This is Jason and the Sympidemic. Before I go dormant again on this particular channel, I did promise a series about underrated historical figures, and what I'm doing here in this particular case is I'm highlighting Colorado Governor Ralph Carr. And you're wondering who he is, and here is what he is. Colorado Governor Ralph Carr was governor of Colorado during the early years of World War II. And in 1942, an executive order was issued by FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, ordering the resettlement of Japanese, Italian, and German immigrants to the west coast, from the west coast of the United States to inland continental states such as his. Now, most governors refused to do this. However, Carr took a very unusual stance, and obviously it was very big racial sentiment towards these particular groups at that time. However, here is what he said about these particular individuals, who, by the way, were full-blown American citizens. And so FDR trampled all over the Constitution to do this. Normally we think of Republicans as the racists, and we think of Democrats as the racial warriors or whatnot. However, this case is different. It's backwards. Governor Carr was a Republican, but he stood up for the rights of these individuals, their constitutional rights. And here's what I'm going to read a quote here. I've got it across my screen, which is why I may not be looking at you perfectly, but I am going to read this quote. It says, Ralph Carr: "They are as loyal to American institutions as you and I. Many of them have been born here, are American citizens with no connection or feeling of loyalty towards the customs and philosophies of Italy, Germany, and Japan. I am not talking on behalf of the Japanese or Italians or of Germans as such when I say this. I am talking to all American people, whether their status be white, brown, black, or regardless of the birthplaces of their grandfathers, when I say that if a majority may deprive a minority of its freedom, contrary to the terms of the Constitution today, then you, as a minority, may be subjected to the same ill will of the majority tomorrow." And then later, in one speech to a large and hostile audience, made up primarily of worried Colorado farmers, Carr said of the evacuees, "They are not going to take over the vegetable business of this state, and they are not going to take over the Arkansas Valley," which is the Arkansas River. "But the Japanese are protected by the same Constitution that protects us. An American citizen of Japanese descent has the same rights as any other citizen. If you harm them, you must first harm me. I was brought up in small towns where I knew the shame and dishonor of race hatred. I grew to despise it because it threatened, pointing at various audience members, the happiness of you and you and you." And it goes on to later say in this article, Carr's advocacy for racial tolerance and the protection of the constitutional rights of the Japanese Americans are generally thought to have cost him his political career. He narrowly lost the 1942 Senate election to incumbent Democrat Senator Edmund Johnson, who in 1942 had advocated using the National Guard to prevent Japanese Americans from entering Colorado, and charged that Carr was more interested in exploiting Japanese labor than in protecting civil liberties, which is obviously not true. Now, one particular thing that came out of this was that it was Camp Amici, which was a camp that was outside of a very small town called Grenada, Colorado. And Grenada had very few native citizens on there. If you look back in Native American history, the Sand Creek Massacre happened not very far from here. About a little under 100 years prior to this. And so this slice of territory in far southeastern Colorado had a history of racial violence. And Governor Carr is an unsung hero to even to this day, because I don't think he's given a lot of credit for the stand that he took. And so there is a square in downtown Denver that is named for him, in a Japanese area called Sakura Square. There's a statue of Governor Carr, and there's also a street named Carr Street, which is named for him, that runs across the western suburbs of Denver. But in general, I believe he is very underrated and stood up for civil rights at a time he took a very unpopular stand. And as I mentioned in this article, with his quotes, it cost him his political career. And all I can say about this is sometimes taking an unpopular stand, even when it's, totally against popularity and trends at the time. Historically, though, Governor Carr was basically exonerated of the negative reputation that this courageous stand took, because the history books now have exonerated him and they have vilified FDR. And I will just add that FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, really stumbled on the Constitution on this one. He completely ran around the Constitution to set up these internment camps that imprisoned Japanese Americans who were citizens of the United States. Trampled on their constitutional rights because they were citizens. This is very different from, the camps these days that are meant to imprison immigrants who came here illegally. This is a case where an entrenched Democrat president stomped on the rights of American citizens to deprive their rights. Governor Carr had them in Colorado while other governors refused. And when he brought them here, he gave them a dignity that prisoners in other camps did not have. They had a high school. They actually had a public high school, an official Colorado high school at the camp, called Grenada High School. And they had a football team there, and they played in the same conferences and leagues that other regional local schools played. And one such game was historic because they only hosted one game in their history because nobody else would travel there. But Holly High School, which is a town about 15 miles east of the camp and right up against the Kansas border, traveled to Grenada to play Grenada High School. Notable on that Holly High School team was Roy Romer, a future governor of Colorado. Was on that team, and he came in 1942, played there. Grenada beat them 6-0. So actually, Grenada High School wound up ultimately being undefeated on its own home field. And, like I said, Governor Carr was exonerated and rectified in history for taking a stand that was so unpopular. So sometimes these days, I ask myself, is there a stand I'd be willing to take that's unpopular in this day and age if I was forced to? Truthfully, there's a couple that I can personally think of. And I would be honoring the memory of Governor Carr in doing so. There are so many things these days that are just unpopular in general that I think if somebody took a stand on, could be vilified but later exonerated because they were on the right side of history. Ralph Carr was on the right side of history. And in this one instance, and I think in several others, if you ask my opinion, FDR was on the wrong side of history. My inspiration for this particular clip was because of a post that I saw from economics professor, quote unquote, Robert Reich, posted with a quote from FDR in 1944, which was 2 years after he ordered this series of internment camps be established with these citizen, mostly Japanese, but a handful of Germans and Italians. And he was defending FDR's economic stances. You can think about that as you will. But on the internment camps, he was absolutely wrong, and history has shown that. Stomping on constitutional rights is never acceptable. Regardless of what you think the cause, if the righteousness of the cause, and FDR believed that he actually used the national security as a reason for doing this. But these people, as Governor Carr said, had no allegiance towards the governments, towards the Nazi governments, or Emperor Hirohito's government, or Mussolini's government. They had already established citizenship and were Americans through and through. So anyway, this is Jason on this epidemic. Thanks for sitting me through this one. So my underrated people in history today, Ralph Carr, governor of Colorado. Served one term, lost his race for the Senate, and left politics forever. But in my heart, his place in history is established. So anyhow, guys, speaking of foreigners, buckle up, because tomorrow we're going to have an interesting one, actually from the Soviet Union. Just as a little clue before I do it. So I'll have one from the Soviet Union tomorrow, and from the same time period. Being a different location entirely, a different type of person. But I think you'll be quite amazed by this one too. So this is Jason and the Sympidemic signing off for tonight. See you tomorrow. Peace out, homies.